I've introduced some of the sub-areas cognitive psychologists focus on in their studies, so that includes perception, attention, memory, motor cognition, language, and then thinking, problem solving, decision making, and so forth. Now, cognitive psychology is then a field that actually is part of a broader field called cognitive science. Cognitive science is a collection of different fields that contribute, and they go sort of from a more abstract philosophical level to a more implementation level in terms of the neurons in our bodies and in different species, but also in artificial intelligence. So cognitive science really relies on philosophy of mind. Thinks about and talks about how the mind is structured and how we can study the mind and so forth. So that's what philosophers have done for a long time. Cognitive science also includes computer scientists who try to create artificial intelligence. As you've seen, a lot of the topics actually deal with taking in information from the environment, processing that information, and then doing something with that information along the lines of decision making, some sort of adaptive output that then can be used by artificial agents. So computer scientists also are very interested in cognitive science in general, and they also feed into that field. I already mentioned cognitive psychology. Linguists are also interested in the mind, and they contribute to cognitive science by considering how languages are structured, how languages are represented in our brains, all of these kinds of questions, how languages are learned, developed, and so forth. And then, of course, neuroscience as well. How does all of this get actually implemented in our brain? How is that we have, a body, a brain, neurons, muscles, all of these things? How are they controlled? How do we use them to translate thinking into actions and all of those kinds of questions? So in cognitive science, in some ways, really the multi-million-dollar question would be, how do we get from brain and neurons to actual behavior? Or how can we study behavior to get a better understanding of what's happening in the neurocircuitry and in the brain? Now, to give you just a little primer of how interesting and counterintuitive these kinds of things can sometimes be, if you actually look at a slice of brain at different ages, at birth, 7 years of age, and then an adult brain. What's interesting is that actually at birth, babies have relatively few neurons. There's still a lot of development going on, and that development includes production of more neurons. So that by 7 years of age, you see actually that there's this massive wilderness, or if you will, there's a jungle in there, many, many neurons, and many more neurons than we have at birth. Interestingly enough, more neurons is not better necessarily. And you can see that because by the time we get to adulthood, many of the neurons have actually died off, and only those that have managed to form meaningful connections with other neurons are those that are actually surviving. So as we lay down memories and so forth, and we recall things, we learn skills and so forth, that gets laid down in our neurocircuitry, and it's not necessarily by building more neurons, but it's more so by making the meaningful connections denser and stronger, and having the neurons that don't really contribute actually die off to make the processes more efficient. So that gives you something to think about when you think about, well, how does brain development work? How does that translate to the control of behavior and so forth? So the big question really is, how do we think about thinking? How does this get laid down in all these different systems, the human brain and also artificial systems? That's one of the key questions of cognitive science overall.